Okay, so the first thing that I did is I used an 18mm socket to remove this nut off of the steering stabilizer so that I can disconnect the steering stabilizer in order to perform the inspection that we need to do. Sometimes in order to loosen it up you need someone to turn the steering side to side a little bit, or stick a crowbar in here and push it out so we can disconnect the steering stabilizer from the tie rod. So the first thing that we're going to do to inspect things is I'm going to have my son jump in the Jeep. He's going to turn on the engine so that the power steering is active. And then he's going to cycle the steering side to side while I check each one of these components and look for excess movement or a clunk or a looseness. I'll look at the tie rod, I'll look at the drag link, I'll look at the ends of the track bar, the collars and so forth. I'll feel the pitman arm. I'll take a look at the sector shaft as it comes out of the steering box. I'll look at these adjustment collars. I'll even look at the ball joints, although it's a lot easier to inspect those in one of the next steps that I'll show in the process. Okay. Alright, so at the sector shaft I feel a little bit of a clunk as it's going back and forth. The pitman arm, I feel a little bit of a clunk. It's a little bit more. This end, I feel a little bit more of a clunk. It's not apparent that the end is really loose. Along here, I'm feeling a little bit of a clunk as it's going back and forth, although I'm not seeing any movement here in this adjustment collar. As I go down to the other end of the drag link end, I actually can see that drag link end going up and down as it's moving back and forth. That's a pretty good sign that that drag link end is worn. When I put my hand on it, I can feel more of a clunk, more play back and forth. That's a pretty good sign that one thing that's going on here is that that drag link end is either loose or worn. We'll check it more to see if it's worn in a minute. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to test this tie rod. I put my hand on the tie rod. I don't feel very much of a clunk at all. When I look at the tie rod end, I'm not seeing the kind of play like there is in the up and down play of that drag link. So the tie rod end from this point looks good. Going down to the other end of the tie rod, I'll put my hand here next to this adjusting sleeve to see what's going on. I'm not hearing or feeling any clunk here, and I'm not feeling any clunk on this side at all. When I look at that end, there's no up and down movement. It's just fine. When I look at the track bar, I'm seeing just a very slight amount of deflection in the bushing. That's normal. When I put my hand on the drag link, or on the track bar, I'm not feeling any clunk. I'm not feeling any movement here. Just a little bit of deflection of the bushing. When I go to the other end of the drag link, there's my adjusting sleeve on the Terraflex track bar. The stock one's a little bit different. I'm feeling that. There's no clunk, there's no play. When I go right here and I feel that bolt, and I feel this track bar, I'm not feeling any play there. It's quite likely that just this initial inspection has exposed the problem of this drag link end, because it's going up and down and I can feel a clunk. as it's going back and forth, and I can actually hear a clunk, and it gets worse as I get closer to this drag link end. Alright, in my inspection checklist, the next thing that I would do would be to remove the track bar by removing the frame side track bar bolt and then the axle side track bar bolt. I would use a 22 millimeter wrench on the back side, or 7/8, it's the same, 7/8 inch or 22 millimeter is the same, and then a 21 millimeter socket or wrench on the front side. The torque specs for that bolt at the frame and at the axle side are 125 foot-pounds. That's quite a bit. And it's not uncommon for those bolts to loosen up a little bit as the suspension cycles, as the bushing bolt sleeve collapses a little bit in the ends of the track bar, or just from normal vibrations in suspension cycling. If those bolts loosen up from their 125 foot-pound torque specs, then that can cause a death wobble problem and a very severe side-to-side movement, and those bracket bolt holes can get ovaled out. For purposes of this video, we're not going to remove the bolts because our initial inspection didn't show any deflection. It didn't show any movement other than on this frame side. There was a little bit of deflection due to the rubber bushing on that side, but not enough to cause a problem, and not enough that there'd be any sort of clunk. So we'll go through some of the rest of the inspection checklist, even though it's clear that so far the primary problem is this drag link end on that side. Alright, one of the next steps in the inspection checklist is to use a large channel lock pliers. Unfortunately, this one that my friend has at his home is not long enough to do what we need to do. What we would do is we'd use the very long channel lock pliers at the bottom and the top of the drag link ends to test for up and down movement. And so I would put the pliers there and I would push up and down to see if there was up and down play movement at the pitman arm end. I would do the same thing at the knuckle end, but the pliers that I have here at my friend's house aren't long enough to do what I need to do. But that's what you would do to check. In this case, what we're going to do is we're going to check the torque specs for that drag link end at the knuckle side, and we're going to see how loose they are. If they're appropriate, then we know that that end is worn, and what my friend needs is a new drag link, at least the end that goes from the adjustment sleeve down to the knuckle. Alright, if I had the proper size channel locks, I would do the same thing to test for up and down movement at the drag link end. I would squeeze them up. If there's up and down movement, there shouldn't be any. Now you need to know, in order for the suspension to be able to cycle, there needs to be rotational movement to allow the suspension to cycle and not break off those ends. So this kind of rotational movement is appropriate and actually necessary. And there needs to be rotational movement also in the drag link end, although it's not as easy typically as the rotational movement on the tie rod. Rotational movement is fine. What we don't want is we don't want side-to-side movement in that end, and we don't want up and down movement, which is usually what happens when an end wears out. In our initial inspection, if I had felt clunks in the tie rod, but it was not as apparent as to whether or not the tie rod end was worn or whether the threads in this adjusting sleeve were worn, then the method that I would use is I would use these channel locks, assuming they were long enough, to squeeze that end and check for up and down movement or play. That would let me know that that end was bad. Alright, what I did is I set the emergency brake, put the transmission in park, and I've used a floor jack that's not quite tall enough, so I have railroad ties to help me out, to jack the passenger front tire up off of the ground a few inches so that we can examine the front passenger side ball joints, both the lower and the upper ball joints, to see if they're worn or if they have excess play. Okay, we have this side jacked up, and in this case we're using a shovel as a long lever underneath the tire to check for excess play. Now, when my son does this, I want you to look at the play in the upper ball joint. So go ahead. See that knuckle dropping in and out of the upper ball joint? It's not supposed to do that. Let's look at the lower one. There's upper play, up and down play in that lower ball joint. Both those ball joints, they're bad. They need to be replaced by heavy-duty replacement ball joints. They're not supposed to have that up and down play. The factory ball joints have kind of a plastic inner, and they're not serviceable or greasable. It's not uncommon for them to wear out. This Jeep has 80,000 miles on it. Many of those miles are with 37-inch tires. That's not uncommon. That wobble from those loose ball joints isn't going to cause full-on really heavy death wobble, but it can cause some pretty bad wobbles when the suspension starts cycling. That combined with this drag link end at the knuckle side, that could cause some problems when you hit railroad ties, when you hit railroad tracks, when you hit the pothole in the road. And that could be a source of clunks as well, going over road imperfections. Now we can see daylight, and when we were going back and forth we saw movement in that ball joint. The other way to check the upper ball joint is side-to-side movement, as well as it can help you check the unit bearing, which is a sealed unit that's inside the knuckle that has studs that the wheel attaches to. So my son's going to grab the top of the tire while the tire's up in the air. Again, it's elevated a couple inches off the ground, and he's going to push it and pull it vigorously back and forth. Go ahead. See, there's no side-to-side movement there. There's no clunking. All you're hearing is the jack going back and forth. That's a good sign that the unit bearing in this Jeep is fine. But that up and down movement, that's a problem. And the lower ball joint shouldn't have the up and down movement like it did before. So the unit bearing is fine, and the front upper ball joint doesn't have side-to-side movement. Alright, on the driver's side, I don't know if you can see it, but there actually is a little bit of daylight between the knuckle and the upper ball joint. And my son's going to go ahead and use the shovel as a lever to check for up and down movement. Go ahead. That's not supposed to happen. You can see up and down movement in the upper ball joint. Let's see if I can get a little bit closer. Yeah, that's not good. Lower ball joint, way too much up and down movement. So my friend needs new ball joints, upper and lower, on both sides. My friend needs a drag link end. Everything else seems to be in pretty good shape. That's good, Nelson. Now on the driver's side, the same as on the passenger side, my son's going to grab the top of the tire and vigorously push back and forth in order to check the upper ball joint for side-to-side play, as well as to see if the unit bearing, the bearing that small outer axle shaft goes through and has studs that you bolt the wheel to. So Nelson, go ahead. So there's no movement there. A better test would be if we had jack stands instead of this wimpy floor jack to help prevent movement. But in any event, it doesn't look like that there's side-to-side movement of the ball joint. We don't hear a clunk of the wheel going back and forth, so the unit bearings are probably fine. On this side as well, there's just clunks because those ball joints are loose. Alright, so we're going to assume for this video that I went ahead and used a torque wrench to just double check. I'm not going to show it, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to double check the torque specs on the front track bar on both the axle side and on the frame side. I'm going to also take a torque wrench to the lower control arm bolts on both sides at the frame and at the front end. I'm going to take a look and inspect the bushings at the front upper control arms to check for cracking on both sides. Those can cause wobbles and shimmies and problems like that as well. So I'm going to inspect those. Then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to reattach the steering stabilizer. My friend's steering stabilizer isn't leaking or anything. It is low because it's in the stock position and it can be subject to getting bashed in by rocks. So this is a sure sign that I need to take my friend wheeling because his steering stabilizer isn't bashed in yet in the stock position. So that's all that we're going to do today, just to show you some of the basic steps of my death wobble and shimmy inspection checklist. If you've checked all of these things and gone through my list once or even twice, sometimes people have gone through it more than twice to find what the problems are. We found the problems in this case in the first try being the upper and lower ball joints on both sides and the drag link end on the passenger side. If you go through the inspection checklist, you're going to be able to find what the problem is. And you want to fix the problem, you want to fix the sources of the problem before you just slap on a heavier duty steering stabilizer that's relocated up out of the stock position. You want to fix the problems first before you install a new steering stabilizer. So that's what we have for today. If you have any questions, you can post in any of the threads on the different Jeep forums where I have my diagnosing death wobbles and non-death wobble shimmy and vibration threads. You can post in there and there'll be people, myself included, will help and answer questions with regard to the material that was covered today. On most of those threads, my inspection checklist is in post number 2, and my screen name on the forums is Planman. If you've found this YouTube video not through one of those websites, just Google Planman, all one word, diagnosing death wobble and non-death wobble shimmies and wobbles, and you'll find this thread on one of the forums. They have a written inspection checklist as well as question and answer that people have about diagnosing these kinds of problems.